Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome again to Philosophy of Mental Illness. Before we discuss how to use the DSM, I thought it might be helpful to talk about the history of the DSM and how we got here. So, the reading from Shorter will give you some of this information. It'll be a little redundant, but Shorter is telling a narrative, whereas this information is supposed to kind of be more cut and dry. This is what happened. Um, so, the DSM 1 with a Roman numeral was published in 1952 and sought to kind of match the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases. The ICD is used around the world, whereas the DSM is more in the United States. Though in research you see it across the board, you don't often see people referring to ICD numbers for mental illness. FYI. So World War II happened prior to this, and people came back from World War II traumatized. We also had various psychological phenomenon going on in Nazi Germany, the sorts of experiments that were happening. So, one, you've got a bunch of veterans coming back that need treatment, and you've got rather disturbing results that happened in concentration camps. This is the standard for the DSM for 16 years, and you'll notice 16 years is about the going rate, if not longer sometimes, between various versions of this, whereas the ICD is going to go through numbers more quickly. In the DSM-2, most notably, it came out in 1968, a very turbulent time in the United States, but didn't really seem to incorporate much of what was going on. In 1972, homosexuality was removed. So homosexuality was removed from the DSM-2, but it was still in there when it was originally published as a condition. DSM-3 comes out 12 years later, 1980, and this is when we start to see significant changes and basis on research. The DSM-3 revised comes out in 87 to correct some of the diagnostic criteria, some of the codes, things like that. There are no major revisions for this update. The DSM-4 comes out 14 years later from the DSM-3 in 1994. Authors here talked, with a wide range of experts, and this is the model we use now in terms of, giant committees and subcommittees. Like, there's this great big organizational structure that ultimately writes the DSM and brings input. So if you're an expert in autism, then it's likely that you'll contribute to that particular section of the DSM. And again, we're looking for more consistency with the ICD. It'll make it easier for people who use the ICD to have the same codes as people using the DSM. This has to do with insurance mostly. Researchers usually don't refer to the codes, but insurance matters. People need to have their care covered. We also saw disorders removed or added, which was interesting. But we also saw, the symptoms of these disorders removed or added, and this is sort of an interesting phenomenon because presumably mental illness didn't change between 1994 and 1980, but the way we are doing research changed. So in 2000, the DSM-4 text revision was published. When I was in college, this is what we were using, even though I was not in college in 2000. You'll see why in a second. It was updated because, we got 6 years later, and research is just flourishing at this time, but it's not going to change that much. You're going to get some errors, updated codes to match the newest version of the ICD, and even though research since 94 had, come up with different diagnostic thresholds for various conditions, none of that was changed. So this was not meant to be a dramatic overhaul. They didn't want to engage in the giant conversation that would ultimately be had before the DSM-5 was published. If you notice on this, I did provide my sources. You don't have to look any of this up, but in order to be thorough, I didn't know any of this off the top of my head, at least not the precise dates. Okay, so the DSM-5 gets its own timeline, and you'll see, like, looking at this timeline and all the things that happened from 1999 to 2013, you'll see why the DSM-5 gets its own timeline, because this is the way the DSM is updated nowadays, and this is why I don't expect to see a DSM-6 anytime soon. So in 1999, they started thinking about the DSM-4, so this is right before the text revision is published. You've got 5 years of international conferences about the DSM. You've got task force members. You've got 13 working groups. So you've got working groups, that are working on, like, in this instance, neurocognitive work group. There was the neurodevelopmental, that's the name or not, but the work group that encompassed the major autism revision, right? So you've got work groups based on people's expertise. Then they published a draft of what it could look like, some criteria for public comment. And of course, lots of people are weighing in. And by public comment, they don't mean like, your neighbor down the street was commenting on this. Unless your neighbor down the street happened to be a psychiatrist. Basically, experts who were not in these working groups were commenting. There were more revisions, and they tried to use this out in the field. And there's all sorts of meetings going on between 2008 and 2013. I distantly worked for someone who was part of the meetings on autism, and before it was announced as a spectrum, our research team is already calling it an autism spectrum disorders. I'm like, okay, I guess this is the way it is now. But that was very controversial for a lot of reasons. Finally, you get some, in 2012, you're going to get some feedback. You're going to get the codes matching up with ICD-10. And then finally, in 2013, the DSM-5 came out. And this is this timeline doesn't show it, but 2013 was very late for what was actually anticipated. People were looking for a DSM-5 much longer, and for a while, you'll see in some papers, it was being referred to as the DSM-V, the Roman numeral 5, and so this change sought to kind of, again, pair up with the ICD, but it's not really a definitional change, just a more practical kind of change. And so we've got the DSM-4 published in 1994 and the DSM-5 published in 2013, right? So 19 years later, which is incredible. Today I want to talk to you about how we classify mental illness. We're going to do a lot of this discussion in class, but to start, I think it's helpful for me to actually show you how to get to the DSM and then explain a little bit of why the DSM is structured this way. So first, let me show you how to get to the DSM. Okay, so you're on your webpage and you go to library. As you see, my computer knows it, .bc.edu. And forgive me if you already know how to do this. Keep listening though, because I'm going to talk about some of the reasoning behind this classification. You can hit limit to online content. I think it helps make things faster. You'll just type in DSM-5 and don't let autocorrect try to make it damn 5 because it does that to me all the time. Okay, search. Okay. Oh, I'll also note that I am accessing this from off campus. So you can access it off campus. It's pretty easy. You'll just have to put in your password. So you won't see my password, but you'll see that I'm putting it in. So the first thing that comes up is this lovely link, and this is where you want to go. Now, if for some reason you do want to look at the DSM, physically, you can go to O'Neill and ask for it on the 3rd floor. It's a reference book, so you can't check it out. And you kind of don't want to, because this is like a massive, it's like this thick, pretty heavy thing that I don't want you to have to carry around. So instead, we use the online version. I've never actually owned the full DSM because it's so easy to do everything online. Okay. click here and it'll like do its thing. That's a new way of doing it. So sign in to your Boston College ID. If you're off campus, if you're not off campus, it should just, if you're on campus, it should just go through. Okay, so you'll get this page and you'll get like, yeah, good. So there's all sorts of ads that will pop up and we can talk about why that might be um, problematic. So close out your ads. Sometimes the featured content's pretty interesting, but that's not what we're focusing on. Okay, so you'll get ads, you'll get all that stuff popping up, but where you want to go is the DSM library. So today we're going to go to the DSM-5, but on other days you'll need to look at clinical cases. So it's all in the same tab here. Keep in mind that's where the clinical cases are for when we talk about specific cases that are on the syllabus. So for now, DSM-5. Okay, you get this page. Section 1 kind of describes the DSM, which we're actually going to talk about in some of our readings. So there's no need to look at that unless you're just curious. And then section 2 has all the disorders. Now, disorders are listed by category. So you have to understand, you have to know that, for instance, autism is under neurodevelopmental disorders, right? You have to pay attention that bipolar and depressive disorders are separate. Disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders are separate from neurodevelopmental disorders. So if at first you can't find your condition that you're, researching, you should be able to find it elsewhere. And if you're having like a really hard time, you can email me and I'm happy to help you. But it just might not be in the category you're expecting it to be under. For example, I would expect conduct disorder to be under neurodevelopmental disorders, and it's not. It has its own, this category, which it also fits in there pretty nicely. Okay, so once you've figured out which one of these makes the most sense for your disorder, you're gonna want to click on it. So, for instance, let's say that we are researching narcissistic personality disorder. I don't think that's one of your options, so that's why I'm gonna do it here. So that is under personality disorders. So again, you'll get kind of a bunch of like upfront stuff. So you're like, wait, so narcissistic is here, but that doesn't tell me how to get to it. Like it's somewhere else on this page, right? So it's helpful, no matter which disorder you're looking up, to click on sections. And you'll see narcissistic personality disorder has its own section. So if you click on it, it'll jump you down the page to the diagnostic criteria. And this is really important to kind of get a sense of what this disorder looks like. What are the symptoms? What's it going on, right? It doesn't tell you who gets this disorder, doesn't tell you why, it doesn't tell you how long it lasts or anything like that, but it does give you some context for what the symptoms look like. Now I will say this one does have, it does say that beginning by early adulthood, so it gives you some idea of what's going on here. And then you have to have 5 or more of these symptoms in order to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. It's not that we don't care about individuals and the conditions they experience. It's more that our class is concerned about how this is diagnosed across the board. If that means no exceptions, that's typically how it's done. That's a big deal for a lot of people, not one person that might have this condition, right? You can also talk about, sometimes you'll notice that the symptoms are maybe vague or unclear who meets the criteria. So for instance, has a grandiose sense of self-importance. You might think that most politicians meet this, right? If you think that you can run the country, then wow, you must think you're pretty important, right? You might think that for some people that's really obvious that they think they're self-important, and other people think they're self-important but are smart enough not to tell you that or something, right? So when you're looking at the symptoms of your condition, kind of think about, what questions do you have about how this might manifest or how this is confusing when it comes to like dividing people into categories. The other part you want to look at diagnostic features. It gives you more, kind of a more in-depth description of what's going on and what the symptoms look like. So we get again this first criteria of grandiose sense of self-importance, and talk about how they routinely overestimate their abilities and inflate their accomplishments, often appearing boastful and pretentious. They may blithely assume that others attribute the same value to their efforts and may be surprised when the praise they expect and feel they deserve is not um, forthcoming. Uh, the By judging themselves to be better, they underestimate what others are doing. Um, so you get a better idea here. So turns out if you are really, really important for one reason or another, um, they're not going to say that you meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Um, if you're like, yeah, I'm my parents' only child. They really care about me. You're probably right, and like, yeah, as a child, as a person who has a bunch of siblings, is definitely like not the youngest, so not the highest on the pecking order. Might be a little jealous of you, but it doesn't mean you have narcissistic personality disorder. You just might be missing some social cues, and that's a whole different conversation, right? So it's important to look at what the symptoms look like in context. So we can skip associated features. Prevalence is interesting. It doesn't tell you necessarily how to how this is diagnosed, but it tells you how often it's diagnosed. And it seems 0 to 6.2. One, that's a pretty big range, and two, that's not that many people. So the idea here is to show that not that many people have narcissistic personality disorder. It's not diagnosed that often. So that's kind of the big takeaway from that section. And your section, might look differently. It might mention things about gender. Make sure you want to write that down. Um, right, there's this notion here. This is always interesting to look at. You're not required. 50 to 75% are male, so it seems like either it's split evenly or more individuals are male. So um, if we get more diagnostic precision, then we might know. But it does seem to be a disorder that affects mostly men. And then development in course. Um, I love this because it's like, look, teenagers are kind of full of themselves, but we don't think they have narcissistic personality disorder, or even that they'll go on to have narcissistic personality disorder. It's kind of a developmental thing that adolescents go through, right? So it's helpful to think about what this looks like across the lifespan, if there are going to be signs in childhood, or if we're saying children can't have this condition, which is the case with personality disorders. Um, and then there's some consequences. They might have special difficulties adjusting to the onset of physical and occupational limitations that are inherent in the aging process. So as they get older, people with narcissistic personality can struggle with adapting their career to that, to the limitations of age, right? Which, it makes sense. As we get older, it becomes more difficult. Um, we don't have the same amount of energy, right? Might not be, we don't look the same, right? So you can see kind of how that's discussed here, and then putting that in context of the symptoms. If someone's getting diagnosed later in life, their presentation is going to look different. So these are the things to look for when you're doing your individual DSM research. And feel free to ask any questions about how the DSM works. I'm happy to help. But this should hopefully, in conjunction with the guide for research, should help you be able to navigate this assignment. Okay, one other thing I wanted to discuss, well, two other things. First, just a reminder again, we're not using the DSM as clinicians. We are not clinicians. I'm not a clinician, you're not a clinician, and we're reading it more as, this academic interest kind of thing. We're not using it to diagnose people. If you have concerns about yourself or a loved one, I think it'd be appropriate to talk to a mental health professional. And I'm not, I do research, but I don't diagnose people. One day you might be one of the people who diagnoses people, and that'd be great. That's a noble career. But for now, you don't have that expertise. So don't, it's very easy to read something and kind of
either, panic or be like, oh, this is the answer. Don't make any of those conclusions on your own as we're doing this exercise. The second thing I wanted to talk about is why we work with the DSM in this class. So many of you may be aware that there's an international classification system called the ICD. And it's interesting. A lot of research papers will list like, this is, DSM disorder, blah, blah, blah. And then they could have an equivalent in the ICD, but most research in the English speaking world uses the DSM, even though it's the American Psychiatric Association that puts it on. So that's one reason why it's helpful. It helps us put context to a lot of the articles we're reading about classification, and then in the future about philosophical issues of agency and responsibility, things like that. It's also, the disorders in the DSM are organized in such a way that these are the things that people are making research claims about in the philosophy of mental illness. So in order to engage in that conversation, you have to be able to understand what they are talking about. Now, that doesn't mean I discourage you from looking at like how mental illness is classified in other countries. I think that's important. But for this class, when we talk about specific conditions, we're talking about what's listed in the DSM. We will have a chance to talk about trauma in the international community, and hopefully that'll be really helpful to, broaden your context as to what mental illness research looks like. Another note about the DSM classification. So as I mentioned, we focused almost primarily on the diagnostic criteria and codes, and we also talk about these clinical cases. And a section we really don't talk about is this emerging measures and models. It comes up a little bit in this idea of why mental illnesses are categorical versus dimensional. So why do we have discrete like depression, no depression, rather than a scale of what it means to be depressed? So that comes up in this section. There's discussion of what it means to have more dimensional analysis, what it means to, be researching a condition that's not yet a DSM-5 condition. So that's particularly interesting. So they've included in this section a disorder that's, kind of pre-schizophrenic. So diagnosing schizophrenia or schizoid personality disorder in children and what that looks like. That's in this section. They've expanded eating disorders. I think binge eating disorder is in this section. So what they've done is they've included this and said, look, we know there's research ongoing about this. Letting clinicians know that there's data about the way these conditions could be treated, who has these conditions, that kind of thing. So it's a way of sharing information without committing to the idea that these things are disorders. The DSM moves slowly. DSM-5 was supposed to come out, I want to say in 2010, but it didn't come out until 2013. Unclear when we will see a DSM-6. It feels like we'll perhaps due for one. So we'll see about that. Keep your eyes open. The other part that's in here is assessment measures. We aren't going to talk about the ones that are in the DSM-5 as much, but you'll see in some of the articles that we read that assessment really matters when it comes to classification. For certain disorders, there are very well-established assessment criteria, whether that means, a written exam or an interview. And in some cases, rarer cases, observational. So like with autism, you don't just ask a child about their experience with autism. You have certain play model situations you can do, and it's it's very interesting. So it does matter how we assess it and sort of what assumptions our assessments are based upon, because the assumptions are that we can cleanly distinguish someone who's depressed from someone who's not depressed, that it's not a scale, right? Our assessment will tell you how close you got, but it won't tell you whether or not you need treatment, for instance. Right. So that's kind of a different question. So there are questions in this section about that. This part of the semester we're talking about what makes something a mental illness. Why do those criteria make something a mental illness? And should we think about it differently? What does it mean to expand those borders, right? As we'll talk about, we don't want to expand things so much that there is no notion of mental illness, but we also don't want to make the notion of mental illness so tight that we exclude people who are suffering and need treatment. So um, it's an interesting, ongoing conversation. I look forward to chatting with you about it.